This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and today I'm continuing with my limited review for Strixhaven. So far, I've looked at all the mono blue and mono white cards, and today I'm continuing with mono black. As the week goes on, I'll be covering all of the other cards in the set before concluding the set review with an archetype guide. Keep in mind that in this review, I'm only talking about limited formats. That's draft and sealed. I'm not talking about formats like standard or commander. I conclude my evaluation of each of these cards with a letter grade that sort of sums up my thoughts about the card, and if you're new to my set reviews, you can find an explanation of what each grade means in the description of this video. Another notable thing about Strixhaven is that it has mystical archive cards. These are a special set of reprints, and one card from the archive appears in every single Strixhaven pack, so I'll also be reviewing all of those cards in the last part of each of these videos. Alright, let's look at our first black card. First, it's Arrogant Poet, which costs 1 generic and a black for a 2/1 human warlock at common, and when it attacks you can pay 2 life, and if you do, it gains flying until end of turn. This is a nice aggressive creature that reminds me of the Suicide Black days of Magic. We've seen a lot of 2-mana 2/1s that gain flying when they attack be pretty good, and while this is admittedly worse as a result of having to pay life to make that happen, it will be a nice card to have in black aggressive decks. Gaining flying goes a long way towards making this 2-drop stay relevant all game long. Black-green will do well with this card because it's a deck that can gain life, so paying life is less painful, and it'll be a good place to put plus and plus 1 counters and things like that. Overall, I'm giving this a C. If aggro decks in this format turn out to be really good, I could definitely see it bumping up to a C+, though. Next up, it's Baleful Mastery, which for 3 generic and a black is a rare instant, and it says you may pay 1 generic and a black rather than pay this spell's mana cost. If the 1 generic and a black cost was paid, an opponent draws a card, and then the actual effect it has is exile target creature or planeswalker. Even if this was just a card you can only ever cast for 3 and a black, it would be premium removal, since it straight up exiles creatures at instant speed for 4 mana. The fact you can also cast this for 1 and a black in a pinch is nice, even with the downside of your opponent drawing a card. Sometimes you'll only have 1 and a black up, and you just have to use it to not die or something like that, and that will feel good in those situations. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Brackish Trudge, which for 2 generic and a black is a 4/2 fungus beast at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, it does so tapped, and it has an activated ability. You can pay 1 generic and a black to return it from your graveyard to your hand. Activate only if you gained life this turn. This is a powerful life gain payoff. It begins as a 3-mana 4/2 that comes into play tapped, which is already a fairly passable card. The fact that this can return to your hand when you gain life is going to be a big problem for your opponent in the long run, as it has a kind of size that may just let it attack every single turn, since the downside of it trading with something is so minimal. There is enough life gain in this set that this looks like a real value engine. Note, by the way, you can use the ability at instant speed, so gaining life on your opponent's turn could also be useful. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Callous Bloodmage, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/1 vampire warlock at rare, and when it enters the battlefield, you have 3 options. They are, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, you draw a card and you lose 1 life, or exile target player's graveyard. Most of the time with this, you'll be choosing one of the first 2 modes here. 3 mana for a 2/1 that makes a 1/1 token, or 3 mana for a 2/1 that draws you a card is a nice couple of things to choose between, and if this was just either of those, it would be something you basically never cut, and probably at least a B-. Going after a graveyard will come up in this format too, as there are some significant graveyard shenanigans around, especially in red-white. I think this is a pretty easy first pick. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Confront the Past, which costs X generic and a black for a rare sorcery, Lesson, and it's a modal card. You have 2 options. One is return target planeswalker card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, or remove twice X loyalty counters from target planeswalker an opponent controls. So this card isn't very good and limited. There's just not very many planeswalkers, and they're all in Mythic Rare. I mean, sure, if you see this late and you have some learn going on, having this ready to get out of your sideboard in the rare event that you do run into an opponent who has a planeswalker, or maybe you already have a planeswalker, will definitely be some upside for your learn cards, but you're not going to run into planeswalkers, again, very often. And that's why I think this is a straight F as a main deck card and like a D out of your lesson board. I guess one could say that if you do have a planeswalker, In your deck, maybe it's more like a C, but it's just going to be such a rare occurrence that I think this is probably the right way to grade it. Next up, it's Crushing Disappointment, which for 3 generic and a black is a common instant. Each player loses 2 life and you draw 2 cards. This isn't awesome. 4 mana to draw 2 at instant speed is alright, and it's nice the life loss is symmetrical, but I tend to have a hard time getting behind this kind of card draw in Limited. It's pretty inefficient and expensive, and by choosing to spend 4 of your mana to cast this, you probably already paid some life in a way, since you didn't add to your board with that mana. Then, paying more life can be surprisingly painful. Again, it is nice that it can give you some reach against some opponents, and in black-green especially, you'll be able to gain life easily, and you don't need to worry about losing life as much. But I still think this is a card that gets cut a reasonable chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Essence Infusion, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature. It gains lifelink until end of turn. This gives a pretty efficient boost of 2 +1/+1 counters, and lifelink until end of turn is pretty nice. It makes your creature gain you a bunch of life, making the race a lot harder for your opponent. However, note it is a sorcery, and it's not a way to interact. Your opponent can really punish you in response to you using it too, but the upside here is good enough for this to be playable anyway. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Eye Twitch, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 Eye Bat at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it dies, you learn. This is a new mechanic in the set that lets you either get a lesson from your sideboard or rummage. 1 mana 1/1 flyers often aren't really worth it in Limited because they are so quickly outclassed, but this has quite the useful death trigger. So you will need to have picked up a few lessons for cards like this to be at their best, but it's nice you can rummage with them in a pinch. This will feel like drawing a card or close enough to drawing a card often enough that I think it makes this card pretty good. It's also not a bad place to stick +1/+1 counters, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Flunk, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is 7 minus the number of cards in that creature's controller's hand. This is going to be a bit awkward sometimes, but from the mid-game on, you're going to have a super efficient removal spell in most cases. Your opponent drawing cards in response is going to be a thing that happens sometimes, but that's okay. It will be premium often enough that I think I'm interested in taking this with a first pick sometimes. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Go Blank, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target player discards 2 cards, then exile all cards from that player's graveyard. They keep giving us these upgraded Mind Rots lately, and I like it. Normally, Mind Rot effects are not so good in Limited. They don't impact the board, and they get bad in the late game. But by giving these cards something else to do, in this case, exiling the graveyard, you at least get something out of this card, even when it can't make your opponent discard anything. In most formats, exiling the graveyard will have at least a small effect on most decks, and in this format, against a red-white deck, it'll probably have a significant effect. Now, all that said, this still isn't great. It just isn't the D+ that I usually give Mind Rot. I think it does enough to be a C-. Next up, it's Hunt for Specimens, which for 1 generic and a black is a common sorcery, and it says create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, and it has Learn. This is alright, provided you have something decent to grab from your sideboard, and rummaging isn't the worst fail case either. The token gains you life, and black-green likes that too. This isn't great, and it probably gets cut a bunch, but I think it's playable enough. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Lash of Malice, which for 1 black mana is a common instant, and it says target creature gets +2, -2 until end of turn. This seems pretty good to me. In a lot of ways, it's a shock that trades in the upside of being able to burn the opponent, for the upside that you can actually use this as a trick on some of your bigger creatures. This set has a ton of X2s, so this will definitely feel like premium removal with nice upside. I'm starting it at B-, but if this format ends up being even more overloaded with X2s and I'm thinking, it may be even better. It's also a cheap spell for Magecraft, of course. Next up, it's Leech Fanatic, which for 1 generic and a black is a 2/2 human warlock at common, and as long as it's your turn, it has lifelink. We've seen pretty much this same card before, and it really overperformed, and I think this will here too. Lifelink is already pretty nice, but this format has a legit life gain archetype in black-green, and cards with lifelink also like getting +1/+1 counters, and that's good news for black-white. And overall, that makes this a pretty high-quality common, giving it a C+. Next, it's Mage Hunter, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/4 horror at uncommon, and whenever an opponent casts or copies an instant or sorcery spell, they lose 1 life. This seems solid. There's lots of instants and sorceries in this set, but there probably aren't so many for this to be incredible. It has alright stats and will punish your opponent some if it sticks around. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mage Hunter's Onslaught, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a common sorcery, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker. Whenever a creature blocks this turn, its controller loses 1 life. This is a nice removal spell. It's definitely a little bit clunky as a 4-mana sorcery, but it does kill anything, and the upside of punishing an opponent for blocking will sometimes have a pretty real effect. Taking away their best blocker and then attacking after you use this seems like a pretty good sequence. I think this sneaks into the lower range of first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. This is the kind of card, though, that if this format's really fast and you need to be killing cheap creatures on a regular basis, Mage Hunter's Onslaught would lose some of its value, probably go down to a C+. But for now, I think it's probably about a B-. Next up, it's Necrotic Fumes, which for 1 generic and 2 black is an uncommon sorcery lesson. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to exile a creature you control, and then you exile target creature or planeswalker. So this isn't the most amazing removal spell ever. You have to 2-for-1 yourself to use it, and it's a sorcery, but it would be kind of a passable card in your main deck, and I think that means it's like a C there. It will be absolutely great to grab when you learn, though, as it's a removal spell that can deal with anything, and that's a nice thing to be able to wish for. I think you should value this closer to a B, but the caveat that it's probably not more than a C in your main deck, and in an ideal world, you're definitely playing it in your sideboard and having a couple cards with Learn. Next up, it's Novice Dissector, which for 3 generic and a black is a 3/3 Troll Warlock at common. You can pay 1 generic mana and sacrifice another creature to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, activate only as a sorcery. This starts out as a Hill Giant, which is not so good, but it does have a pretty reasonable ability. Note, by the way, it lets you put the counter wherever. Lots of times when we see this effect, only the creature who does the sacrificing ends up getting the counters, but that's not true here, and that's good news for sure, as putting the counters on flyers and stuff like that sounds pretty good. There are also, as we've seen in this video, pest tokens that are really worth sacrificing too. I think this is a pretty solid playable and probably a key card for the black-white deck. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Auric Lore Mage, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 3/3 human warlock at rare. You can tap it and search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, and then shuffle. If it's an instant or sorcery, you put a +1/+1 counter on Auric Lore Mage. So this is a 4-mana 3/3 that can gain a +1/+1 counter every turn, and that's a pretty nice card. And sure, you have to give up an instant or sorcery in your deck for that to happen, but that mostly isn't even downside. If you're in black, theoretically, you'll have ways to take advantage of what's going on in your graveyard too, so if you can get some additional benefits out of throwing things in there. Next up, it's Plum the Forbidden, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and as an additional cost to cast it, you can sacrifice 1 or more creatures. When you do, copy this spell for each creature sacrificed this way. You draw a card and you lose 1 life. So this has a pretty reasonable fail case and a potentially really amazing ceiling. 2 mana to pay 1 life and draw a card as an instant isn't terrible, and if you start copying it, it gets a lot nicer. It's also an instant, so you will have a really wide window of ways to use this to get the extra copies, like after setting up blocks that will kill your creatures anyway, or in response to removal. Sacrificing pests to this will be particularly satisfying because you'll even gain the life back. Keep in mind too that everything with Magecraft will trigger for every single copy. Now, there will be times where you just can't afford to make the copies, but like I said, I think this has a reasonable fail case, and I think the whole package here is pretty appealing. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Poet's Quill, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare artifact equipment. When it enters the battlefield, you learn, an equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has lifelink, and the equip cost is 1 generic and a black. This seems like a pretty good piece of equipment. It basically cantrips when it comes into play, thanks to Learn, and then +1/+1 and lifelink for the cost of playing this and equipping it is actually pretty reasonable. So even if it didn't Learn, this would probably be like a C. Lifelink can really make racing a challenge for your opponent, and putting it on just about any creature is a significant upgrade. Overall, I think this is a B. Next up, it's Professor Onyx, which for 4 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare planeswalker, Liliana, with 5 loyalty. She has Magecraft, so whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, she drains the opponent 2 life. She has a +1 that says you lose 1 life. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. She has a -3, which says each opponent sacrifices a creature with the greatest power among creatures that player controls. And her ultimate is a -8 that says each opponent may discard a card. If they don't, they lose 3 life. Repeat this process 6 more times. Unsurprisingly, this Planeswalker is really, really strong. Her -3 will typically kill whatever your opponent's best creature is. And yes, sometimes it won't line up that way, and that will be annoying, but you're still getting rid of something pretty good. If you're behind, you'll probably start with that -3 most of the time. If you're ahead, you can use her +1 for amazing card selection, as well as add some stuff to the graveyard. She's also got a very powerful static ability. Draining your opponent 2 life for every instant or sorcery you play is not a small thing, and that can really alter races. Her ultimate can be a little bit inconsistent, but it will win the game a significant chunk of the time too. The one thing she lacks is a way to protect herself, but I think having the card draw and removal options plus a powerful static ability is enough for me to get over that. She's a bomb. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Professor's Warning, which for 1 black mana is a common instant, and it says choose one, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, or target creature gains indestructible until end of turn. If this card did only one of these two things, it wouldn't be very good. 1 mana just isn't a good rate for either of those things, and the bigger problem really is that you're giving up a whole card. Not really the mana, but the fact that you're using up a whole card for something that doesn't really feel like it's worth a single card. But this card has a couple of things going on that make this a lot better than it would be. For one thing, it's a modal card, and giving you options does make this kind of effect better, even if sometimes it won't feel great. And another key factor is that Magecraft is going to love cheap spells like this, and as a result, I think this is a C-. Next up, it's Promising Duskmage, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/3 human warlock at common, and when it dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, to draw a card. This is a nice little +1/+1 counter payoff. Sometimes when you put a counter on something, it's a bummer that it gets killed, but this makes sure to give you some value no matter what. I think there are enough ways to put +1/+1 counters on stuff in this set that this is going to be a pretty key common for any deck interested in taking advantage of those synergies. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Sedgemoor Witch, which for 2 generic and a black is a 3/2 human warlock at rare. It's got Menace. It has Ward, pay 3 life, and that means if your opponent wants to target it with something, that spell will get countered unless they pay 3 life. And she has Magecraft, and hers says whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery, create a 1/1 black and green past creature token with when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. This is a really good 3 mana creature. It comes with good French vanilla stats and Ward, which makes it so that no matter what, you'll at least hurt your opponent a little bit. And a 3/2 with Menace can often attack pretty readily in the early game. Then you add an incredibly powerful Magecraft trigger to the mix, and we're talking about a bomb. If she really starts churning out those tokens, your opponent will be done. I think this is always going to feel good to play and always give you some value, and will really take over games if left unchecked. I do think it's small and vulnerable, and for me that keeps it from being like a solid bomb, like a straight up A, but it's pretty close. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Spectre of the Fens, which for 3 generic and a black is a 2/3 Spectre at common with flying, and you can pay 5 generic and a black to drain an opponent 2 life. This doesn't have the greatest stats, but it has a late game mana sink ability that is serviceable, especially in decks interested in gaining life. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Tenured Inkcaster, which for 4 generic and a black is a 2/2 vampire warlock at uncommon, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it attacks, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. This is another really potent +1/+1 counter payoff. When it comes down, it immediately buffs a creature and makes it so that creature drains the opponent for 1 life anytime it attacks. That's not a bad deal, and that's pretty much the fail case. If you end up with a synergistic +1/+1 counter deck, her presence on the board will make the game close to unwinnable for the opponent. Now, she is super undersized for her cost, so taking her down won't be too hard, but left unchecked, she does seem pretty great. I'm giving her a B-. Next up, it's Umbral Juke, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says choose one. Target player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, or create a 2/1 white and black inkling creature token with flying. This has 2 pretty reasonable modes. 3 mana for a 2/1 flyer with flash is fine, and 3 mana for an edict is alright too, especially because this is an instant. Individually, those cards would be a C- and a C respectively. I think having the 2 options together is enough for this to be a C+. Next up, it's Unwilling Ingredient, which for 1 black mana is a 1/1 frog at common. It's got Menace, and you can pay 2 generic and a black and exile it from your graveyard to draw a card and lose 1 life. This is a solid little common. In the early game, it will chip in for a few damage and be a good place to put +1/+1 counters. Then in the later part of the game, you can cash it in for a card, which always feels pretty good and limited when you have the mana lying around. This is a C. Alright, Unwilling Ingredient was our final regular mono-black card that will appear in Strixhaven draft boosters. We're going to move now to the mono-black Mystical Archive cards. Remember, every single Strixhaven pack will have 1 Mystical Archive card, and that means there's going to be 24 in every draft pod. So what that means is You're going to see these, but they're not going to be all over the place either, but it is important to kind of know how to value them because you will be making the decisions often enough. Alright, let's look at our first black Mystical Archive card, which is Agonizing Remorse, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, or a card from their graveyard, exile that card, you lose 1 life. This was a good discard spell the last time we saw it, and I think it'll be pretty good here. It can disrupt the opponent pretty much all game long, and having a fail case of exiling a card in their graveyard isn't too shabby. I think black decks will always play their first copy of this. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Crux of Fate, which for 3 generic and 2 black is a mythic rare sorcery, and it says choose one, destroy all dragon creatures, or destroy all non-dragon creatures. This is a very strong board sweeper, and probably a little better here than it was in Tarkir Limited. Tarkir had lots of dragons at lower rarities, so making this one-sided could happen, but the downside was that it was also likely your opponent had a dragon that would survive this. There are dragons in this set too, but mostly at higher rarities, so this will basically just be a 5-mana sweeper, which is something I'm very interested in playing. It's a powerful, irreplaceable effect, it reshapes the board drastically, and if you cast this, you're usually going to win the game. All of that makes it a bomb. I'm giving it an A. Next up, it's Dark Ritual, which for 1 black mana is a rare instant, and it says add 3 black mana. This is a card that people tend to hugely overrate in Limited, just because they know it's so good in other formats. But keep in mind, those formats are constructed. And yes, getting a big mana boost on turn 1 can be quite strong, but think about all the other ritual type effects we've seen in Limited. Basically, none of them were good. This is because you basically 2-for-1 yourself to get a mana advantage, and that just won't be worth it in Limited most of the time. Now, there is no question that playing a 3-drop on turn 1 is strong, and I'm not saying this is straight up unplayable in Limited, but I would imagine a lot of people will be snatching this up because they think it's super powerful, and it just isn't in Limited. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Demonic Tutor, which for 1 generic and a black is a mythic rare sorcery. And it says search your library for a card, put the card into your hand, and then shuffle. This is another card that people will likely overrate based on how good it is in other formats. Although it probably is better than Dark Ritual in this format. It basically amounts to a 2-mana draw spell. And sure, you draw exactly what you want, and that is very powerful card selection, but it is really dependent on having actual good things to tutor up. It will get better the more good tutor targets you have, and I'm talking removal and bombs. This is significantly better than most tutors we see in Limited. Those are often way more mana or more restrictive, but Demonic Tutor lets you grab whatever you want. And I'm not saying it's bad. You know, I did say people will overrate it. I think a lot of people will think it's like an A+, but it's not. But it is still a really good card and a pretty high pick. The ability to search up whatever you want for this cheap is pretty strong. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Doomblade, which for 1 generic and a black is a rare instant, and it says destroy target non-black creature. This is the first time in a while since we've seen Doomblade. It's premium removal, can kill most stuff at instant speed and for only 2 mana. This is the kind of Mystical Archive card that you'll take over most regular cards in the set because it's just so good at what it does. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Duress, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon sorcery, and it says target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-creature, non-land card from it. That player discards that card. This will be a little better in a format with more non-creature spells and Magecraft, but it probably still isn't going to be that good if you play it in your main deck. I'm going to say it's a D+ there, and a C+ out of your sideboard. Next up, it's Eliminate, which for 1 generic and a black is an uncommon instant, and it says destroy target creature or planeswalker with mana value 3 or less. This kills a significant percentage of creatures, and it does it efficiently. That's enough for it to be premium. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Inquisition of Kozilek, which is a rare sorcery, and it says target player reveals their hand. You choose an online card from it with mana value 3 or less. That player discards that card. This is a pretty good discard spell. It will be a powerful way to disrupt an opponent's early game plan when you play it on turn 1. Now, like most discard spells, it often has diminishing returns in the late game, and that's definitely true here, since it can only hit cheaper cards. Imagine drawing this when you and your opponent are on top deck mode. That's definitely going to hurt. Though it is cheap, and it can trigger Magecraft, and that's a thing. Basically, it's going to be really disruptive early and kind of bad late, and overall, I think that makes me want to give it a C. Next up, it's Sign in Blood, which costs 2 black mana for a rare sorcery, and it says target player draws 2 cards and loses 2 life. This is a very efficient way to draw 2 cards, something that normally costs 3 mana. I'll gladly pay the 2 life and 1 less mana. Keep in mind, a card like this gives you a 2-for-1 right away, and paying 2 mana for one of those is quite nice. It also kills your opponent if they're at 2, which does come up sometimes. Now, it's still a draw spell, and you can only fit so many of them into your deck in most formats, since you want to impact the board, but this is so cheap that it's still pretty good. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Tainted Pact, which for 1 generic and a black is a mythic rare instant. It says exile the top card of your library. You may put that card into your hand unless it has the same name as another card exiled this way. Repeat this process until you put a card into your hand or you exile 2 cards with the same name, whichever comes first. So mostly, this isn't going to be very good. It's tempting to look at it and imagine just getting to search up whatever you want with an instant, but it's also a pretty dangerous card to play with. There's no guarantee you'll net 1 card, since once you hit duplicates with it, it just stops. And this includes lands, which you're going to have plenty of duplicates of in Limited. In short, it will be difficult for this to help you find whatever you want, and sometimes it won't even do anything. I think it's a D. Next up, it's Tendrils of Agony, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a rare sorcery, and it says target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. And whenever you cast it, you copy it for each spell cast before it this turn. You may choose new targets for the copies, and that's Storm. By the way, that counts your opponent's spells, so keep that in mind when trying to calculate your Storm count. So this is a powerful card in the Eternal formats, but how good is it here? Well, I would ordinarily not think it was super great, just because making Storm happen on a 4-mana card is a bit tricky. However, because black-green is a life gain deck and because Magecraft counts copied spells, this will probably be a little bit better than it looks. There's also lots of cheap spells that can help you get your Storm count up. It still isn't going to be great in Limited, but it might be a reasonable way to close out some games or buy yourself some time with the life gain. I'm giving it a C. And our last mono-black Mystical Archive card, and the last card we'll be looking at in this video, is Village Rites, which for 1 black mana is an uncommon instant, and as an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a creature, and you draw 2 cards. We see this a lot, and it's always kind of medium. Cashing in a creature and this card to draw 2 doesn't net you more cards, but it does help you find more gas, and oftentimes you'll have a creature worth sacrificing. You can, of course, also use it in response to removal and things like that. Black-green will make a lot of pest tokens, and in those decks, it will feel pretty good. I'm giving this a C. So those are all the black cards that will appear in draft boosters in Strixhaven. Tomorrow I'll be back to talk about the red ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review and other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're looking for the rest of this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.